The night had come early to Ashbury Manor, the sprawling estate nestled deep within the countryside. A mist hung low over the grounds, as if the fog itself had been drawn into the very walls of the manor, seeping through every crack. The windows, dark and vacant, seemed to stare out into the unknown as the clock struck midnight. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with unease, a tension that would settle into every crevice like the scent of damp earth. It had begun earlier that evening when Sir Gregory Hargrove, the manor's owner, had invited a select few guests for a quiet dinner. Despite the elegance of the occasion, a subtle air of discomfort had loomed over the proceedings. Gregory, a man in his late 50s, seemed on edge, constantly glancing at the door as though expecting someone to arrive, or perhaps hoping someone would leave. Miss Marple, a woman of sharp mind and quiet observation, had been present for the evening. A last-minute invitation, she had been told, though she had no reason to suspect any ill intentions. Her seat at the table had afforded her a front-row view to the dynamics between the guests, a mix of old family friends and distant relatives. The conversation was polite, occasionally awkward, as it tended to be among people who had not seen each other for years, if not decades. But there was something about the way Sir Gregory clutched his glass of wine, the nervousness in his voice, as he made light conversation, that made Miss Marple uneasy. At some point during the evening, a loud crash had sounded from upstairs. It was a jarring noise, one that reverberated throughout the manor. Guests had jumped in their seats, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Frobisher, had rushed from the room to investigate. When she returned moments later, her face was pale, her lips trembling. "Sir Gregory," she had whispered, her voice barely audible, "something terrible has happened." The dinner had been promptly interrupted, the guests moved to the drawing room as Gregory's temper flared. He was agitated, ordering everyone to stay in the room while he went to investigate. What had followed was chaos. The police arrived an hour later, finding the scene more perplexing than any could have imagined. The locked study door had been found ajar, though there were no signs of forced entry. Inside, Sir Gregory's wife, Lady Evelyn Hargrove, had been discovered lying in the middle of the floor, her body cold, her hands stretched out in front of her as though she had been reaching for something, someone, before her death. The most puzzling aspect, however, was the clue left behind. A single silver coin, gleaming in the low light of the study, had been placed on the floor beside her. It was unmarked, smooth, and featureless, save for a faint engraving on the edge, a symbol Miss Marple would later recognize as something from her childhood, though she couldn't immediately place it. There were no signs of struggle, no wounds, no obvious cause of death. The medical examiner could offer no immediate answers. Poison, perhaps. But the absence of any sign of ingestion or external injury was troubling. The room had been locked from the inside, yet no one had seen Lady Evelyn in the minutes leading up to the crash. Sir Gregory had been downstairs at the time, as had the other guests. Mrs. Frobisher, who had found the body, claimed she had been in the hallway when she heard the crash, but had not seen anyone enter the study. The investigation from the outset seemed to spiral into confusion. It was only after a thorough search of the house that the missing piece emerged: Lady Evelyn's personal diary. It had been tucked away in a drawer, the pages marked with heavy, scrawling handwriting. The entries were filled with complaints about her husband's erratic behavior, the tension growing between them. But one entry, dated just a week before her death, caught the eye of Inspector Grayson, the lead investigator. "I have seen something," it read. "Something that I cannot explain. It frightens me." I cannot shake the feeling that something has been watching me." The inspector could make little sense of the words. It was clear that Lady Evelyn had been paranoid, but there was no clarity about who or what had been threatening her. It wasn't long before the story reached the ears of Miss Marple. Despite her usual retirement from such cases, there was something about the mystery that gnawed at her. The locked room, the silver coin, the cryptic diary entry. It didn't add up. Upon arriving at Ashbury Manor, Miss Marple wasted no time in studying the scene. She paid close attention to the details: the position of Lady Evelyn's body, the untouched bookshelves, the faint scent of jasmine that seemed to linger in the air. She inspected the silver coin carefully, noting the engravings on the edge. It was an ancient design, one she had seen in a book of old family symbols, but she still couldn't quite place it. What troubled her more was the absence of any other clues. No footprints in the dust, no fingerprints on the glassware, no signs of anyone entering or leaving the room. Her mind worked methodically through the possibilities. Was it a natural death, disguised by someone with knowledge of poisons? Or had there been something more sinister at play? The locked room suggested something clever, perhaps a ruse, a trick to divert attention. But who would go to such lengths? She turned her attention to the diary. She read the entries over and over, looking for patterns or inconsistencies. Lady Evelyn's paranoia seemed to have escalated, but there was a subtle shift in tone as the days passed. The fear became less about people and more about something intangible, something just out of reach. It was as though she were trying to explain something that she couldn't understand herself. Miss Marple asked to speak with the guests who had been present that evening, starting with Sir Gregory. The man was distraught, but there was something about his distress that didn't quite ring true. He spoke of his wife's mental instability, but Miss Marple could tell from the way he avoided her gaze that he was holding something back. The story of the argument they had been having earlier that night seemed rehearsed, too perfect in its simplicity. The investigation had not yet turned up any concrete evidence, but Miss Marple had a growing suspicion. She knew from experience that people's emotions often held the key to uncovering the truth. And Sir Gregory's agitation, his constant shifts in demeanour, was a tell that something far darker was at play. What had happened in that locked study was no accident, and with every passing hour, Miss Marple was more convinced that the solution was buried in the past, tangled in the lives of those who had walked the halls of Ashbury Manor long before Lady Evelyn's death. As the night deepened, Miss Marple stood by the manor's tall windows, watching the fog roll across the grounds. She wasn't just solving a murder. She was unearthing a secret, one that had been hidden beneath layers of lies carefully guarded by the very people who had once called the manor home, and she was getting closer. The following morning, the atmosphere around Ashbury Manor felt more oppressive than ever. The grey skies heavy with the anticipation of yet another investigation. The authorities, led by Inspector Grayson, had been working tirelessly through the night, combing through every inch of the manor. They had questioned the staff again, reviewed the guests' alibis, and searched for any clues that could point to the murderer. Yet so far, nothing had been uncovered that could shed light on the cause of Lady Evelyn's death. The locked study, the eerie silence, the unsettling coin. All of it remained a puzzle that refused to fall into place. Miss Marple had taken a seat by the fire, the room filled with a quiet hum of activity around her. As the others argued over theories, the detective sat still, her sharp eyes flicking between the officers and the guests, noting small details that everyone else seemed to overlook. She had always known that in every mystery, the smallest of things could make all the difference. A soft shuffle interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Frobisher, the housekeeper, was returning to the drawing room, her footsteps quick but hesitant. She appeared dishevelled, her usual poise and composure replaced with a fragile nervousness. Her hands were trembling, and her eyes darted to and fro as though expecting something to leap out of the shadows. Miss Marple watched the woman carefully, noting her visible unease. It was a reaction that struck her as odd. It wasn't just grief or the weight of an unfortunate event. It was something more. "Mrs. Frobisher," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but pointed. "May I speak with you for a moment?" The housekeeper stiffened but nodded, her lips pressed tightly together as she crossed the room to stand before Miss Marple. The detective could see the woman's hands still shaking as she folded them in front of her, a clear sign of anxiety. "I must admit," Miss Marple continued, "I find your reaction to this whole situation quite telling. You seem troubled. You've been on edge since the discovery of Lady Evelyn's body." Mrs. Frobisher swallowed, her eyes flicking toward the door, as though looking for an escape. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple," she stammered, but her voice was too shaky to be convincing. Miss Marple studied the woman for a long moment, her gaze steady and unyielding. "There's something you're not telling us," she said calmly. "Something you know, something you saw. You can trust me, Mrs. Frobisher. If there's anything you've noticed, anything at all, it could be crucial." The housekeeper hesitated, her lips trembling as she weighed the decision in her mind. Finally she exhaled, as if surrendering to something she could no longer keep hidden. I saw something strange last night, just before I found Lady Evelyn," she confessed. "It was nothing I could have explained, but now that I think about it, it seems important." Her eyes dropped to the floor, avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. "I thought I heard voices coming from the study, but no one was supposed to be in there, and then I saw it." "What did you see?" Miss Marple asked gently, coaxing her forward. "Mrs." Frobisher closed her eyes, as though trying to recall the moment with clarity. "There was a shadow standing by the window. I could only see the outline, but it was tall, much taller than anyone else in the house. And then it vanished, like smoke. I thought I was imagining things, but..." Miss Marple's mind began to work quickly, piecing together the fragments of information. A shadow, a strange figure in the study. It was the kind of detail that most would dismiss. But not Miss Marple. It was just the sort of thing that hinted at something far deeper. "Where were you when you saw this?" she asked, her voice steady. "Outside the study door, just before I went in," Mrs. Frobisher replied. "I thought I heard someone inside, but when I opened the door, nothing. The room was empty, save for Lady Evelyn." Miss Marple's mind raced, her thoughts shifting from one possibility to another. The ghostly figure that Mrs. Frobisher had seen, had it been a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the wind outside, or was it something more sinister? The question lingered in the air like a storm cloud, and the detective could feel its weight pressing down on her. She dismissed Mrs. Frobisher for the time being, her attention drawn to the rest of the scene. The manor had been thoroughly examined by the police, but Miss Marple knew that sometimes the most significant details could be overlooked when the investigation was too focused on routine procedures. She made her way to the study, stepping inside with deliberate calm. The room was just as it had been the night before, but now the faint scent of something stale lingered in the air, a reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. She carefully examined the surroundings once again, though this time her eyes did not linger on the obvious: the overturned furniture, the broken glass, the untouched papers scattered across the desk. Instead, she turned her focus to something more subtle, a small, seemingly insignificant object that lay half-hidden behind a stack of books on the windowsill. It was a small, black velvet pouch, neatly folded. It should have been impossible to overlook, yet no one had noticed it before, not even the inspector. Miss Marple gently picked it up, her fingers brushing over the smooth fabric. There was no sound of coins or metal, but the pouch seemed oddly dense, as though it contained something more than the eye could discern. Her mind snapped into focus as she untied the string. Inside was a collection of small, finely crafted objects, small trinkets, each one carefully carved with intricate designs. It was a collection of miniature statues, no taller than an inch, each one resembling a different animal: a lion, an owl, a fox, and several others. It was an unusual collection, one that Miss Marple had never seen before, and yet the craftsmanship reminded her of something she had seen in her youth. The faint smell of antiquity filled the air as she held the trinkets in her palm. The symbolism of the animals, she realized, was not arbitrary. The lion symbolized power, the owl wisdom, and the fox cunning. The trinkets were not just decorative, they were a message. But from whom? And to whom? The pieces seemed to form part of a larger puzzle, one that Miss Marple could only now begin to understand. There was something about Lady Evelyn's life, her marriage to Sir Gregory, that had been carefully concealed beneath layers of deception, and now those secrets were beginning to resurface, but there was still more to uncover. Why had these trinkets been hidden in the study? Who had placed them there? And why had they been kept so carefully concealed in a place no one had thought to look? The answer was still elusive, but one thing was clear: this mystery was far from solved. As Miss Marple examined the trinkets more closely, she knew the investigation was about to take a significant turn. There was a thread here, a clue so small yet so important that it could unravel everything. But for now, it remained a tantalizing puzzle, one that would soon reveal its secrets. As the morning passed into afternoon, the tension in Ashbury Manor grew palpable. The silence that followed Lady Evelyn's death seemed to hang over the house like an oppressive fog. The police had scoured every inch of the manor, conducted interviews, and questioned every individual who had been in the house the night of the tragedy. Yet still, nothing substantial had been uncovered, at least not by the usual methods. Inspector Grayson, though competent, had reached an impasse. The evidence didn't match any straightforward conclusion, and he was growing increasingly frustrated. It was then that Miss Marple decided it was time to take a more direct approach. She knew that it was never just about the facts, it was about the people. Beneath every word, every gesture, there was the potential for a hidden truth. She began by gathering the witnesses and suspects in the drawing room, where they had gathered earlier that morning. First, she turned her attention to Sir Gregory. He sat stiffly in a leather armchair, his face pale, eyes red from lack of sleep. He appeared every bit the grieving husband, though Miss Marple could not help but notice the unnatural stillness of his posture, the way his fingers nervously toyed with the hem of his sleeve. It was as though he were holding something in, something that didn't belong in the display of grief. Sir Gregory, Miss Marple began, her voice measured but gentle. I understand that this is a difficult time, but I must ask you again. About the night your wife passed. You said you were downstairs at the time of the crash, in the drawing room with your guests. Was anyone else with you? Gregory blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. Yes, of course. Mrs. Frobisher, the housekeeper, and Lord Jonathan, my cousin. We were discussing matters of the estate. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, not allowing the information to pass without scrutiny. And no one left the room during this time? No, Gregory replied too quickly. His eyes shifted toward the door, a slight tremor in his voice betraying his attempt to sound more certain than he felt. I would have noticed. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured. She knew it wasn't enough to simply rely on Sir Gregory's account. His unease was telling but not definitive. And did you hear anything unusual? Any sounds coming from upstairs? Any voices? Gregory shook his head, though his gaze darted briefly to the floor. Nothing at all. We were engaged in conversation. I couldn't have heard anything. Miss Marple allowed a moment of silence to settle in, watching Sir Gregory closely. He was hiding something. That much was clear. But whether it was guilt or fear, she could not yet determine. She then turned to Lord Jonathan, the cousin Sir Gregory had mentioned. He was a thin, pale man in his early 40s, with a sharp nose and eyes that were almost too intelligent for comfort. He sat perched on the edge of his seat, his posture tense, and his fingers drummed impatiently on his knee. It was a subtle sign of agitation that Miss Marple had learned to recognize over the years. Lord Jonathan, she began, her voice even, you were in the room with Sir Gregory when the crash occurred. Can you tell me what happened from your perspective? Jonathan looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were weighing his words carefully. As I told the inspector, we were talking about business, he said slowly, discussing the estate and some investments. I didn't hear anything unusual, certainly not a crash, not until Mrs. Frobisher came in looking so shaken. And you didn't leave the room at any point? Miss Marple pressed. No, Jonathan replied, but his tone lacked conviction and his eyes avoided hers. There was a slight shift in his demeanor, a subtle tightening of his lips that suggested a small lie. Miss Marple didn't push further, though she made a mental note of the inconsistency in his behavior. Something was off, but she couldn't yet say what. She moved next to Mrs. Frobisher, whose hands remained clenched tightly in her lap. Her usual composure was gone. Her face was ashen, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She looked every bit the woman who had spent the night in a state of unrelenting anxiety. But Miss Marple knew better than to be swayed by outward appearances. Mrs. Frobisher, she began softly, I understand you were the one to find Lady Evelyn's body. Can you recall anything unusual about the moments before that? The housekeeper's gaze flickered nervously as she glanced at the others in the room. No, nothing out of the ordinary, she stammered. I was just going to check on her. I heard something and I thought it might be nothing, but then I saw her. I didn't know what to do. Miss Marple leaned in, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Frobisher's. And what was it you heard? A voice? Footsteps? Mrs. Frobisher shook her head quickly. No, no voice. Just a strange feeling, like someone was there with her. She paused, biting her lip. But no, I'm sure it was nothing. Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. There was hesitation in the woman's voice, a reluctance to speak further. Was she hiding something? Miss Marple's suspicion grew, but she chose not to press immediately. She had learned long ago that forcing someone to confess was often the worst way to get to the truth. Instead, she asked, Did you see anyone leave the study during the time you were near it? Mrs. Frobisher's face twisted in confusion. "No, I didn't see anyone," she said almost too quickly. "I told you there was no one." Miss Marple nodded, filing the response away. There was something in her tone that seemed rehearsed, as if she had anticipated the question and prepared an answer ahead of time. But why? Finally, Miss Marple's attention turned to the last person who had been present in the house that night, Lady Evelyn's personal maid, Agnes. The young woman had been standing quietly at the back of the room, her face pale and drawn. She had not yet spoken, and Miss Marple wondered what secrets she might be holding. "Miss Agnes," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I'm sure you've been questioned many times already, but I'd like to hear your version of events." Agnes blinked, her eyes wide as if startled. I don't know what more I can say. I was in the servants' quarters. I didn't hear anything strange. I didn't even know anything had happened until Mrs. Frobisher came to get me." "And when you did learn of Lady Evelyn's death, did you see anyone acting unusually?" Miss Marple asked, watching the young woman carefully. Agnes hesitated, biting her lower lip as if trying to decide whether or not to speak. Her fingers twisted in the fabric of her dress. "I saw Sir Gregory," she said softly, almost in a whisper. "He was in the hallway, just outside the study. He seemed upset, but also strange, like he wasn't quite himself. He didn't say anything. When he saw me, he just hurried past. I don't know why, but it seemed odd." This was the first direct clue Miss Marple had received that indicated Sir Gregory's behaviour might have been more than just the grieving husband's shock. He had been outside the study, at the very time when Lady Evelyn had been discovered, dead inside. Had he been trying to distance himself from the scene, or was there something more to his actions? Miss Marple stood quietly for a moment, her mind sifting through the information. The contradictions were starting to pile up. Each person had a different version of events, yet none of them added up in a way that made sense. Small lies, small evasions, each one a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. But the larger picture was beginning to take form. Someone here was hiding the truth, and Miss Marple was determined to unearth it. She rose slowly from her seat, her gaze sweeping across the room, resting briefly on each person. "The truth," she said softly, "is always just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered, and I will find it, no matter how carefully it's been hidden." The room fell silent, but Miss Marple could feel the weight of her words settle over them. The game had only just begun. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the drawing room, as Miss Marple sat in deep contemplation. The room was quiet now, the suspects' hushed voices trailing off as they awaited her next words. They were all still present, their eyes shifting uneasily between one another. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a sense that the walls themselves were closing in on them. Miss Marple could feel it too, the weight of the web of motives, the hidden truths that lurked just out of reach. Each person, it seemed, had their own reason for being involved in Lady Evelyn's death, yet none of their stories aligned in a way that made sense. Greed, revenge, jealousy, fear, each emotion was a thread, pulling the suspects in different directions. But none of them offered the clear picture she needed. She had spent the afternoon going over the accounts given by Sir Gregory, Lord Jonathan, Mrs. Frobisher, and Agnes. All of them were plausible on the surface, but each had their inconsistencies, small, telltale details that, when examined together, formed a puzzle that was far more intricate than it seemed. The room had become a labyrinth of motives, each one snaking its way through the others, confusing and clouding the truth. Miss Marple turned her attention to the most obvious motive. Sir Gregory, the distraught widower whose grief appeared sincere, but whose actions and responses had raised Miss Marple's suspicions. Gregory had been the last person to see his wife alive, but it wasn't just the timing that seemed suspicious, it was his reaction afterward. He had been strangely aloof when Mrs. Frobisher found Lady Evelyn's body, and his behaviour around the house had been erratic, though not in a way that could be directly attributed to mourning. Could he have killed his wife for financial gain? The possibility seemed likely. The manor, despite its grandeur, was heavily burdened by debts that had only increased over the years. Lady Evelyn had long managed the estate's finances, a task she was both skilled and protective of. Sir Gregory, however, had been known to take risks in his business ventures, and there were whispers of growing tensions between them, especially when it came to their differing approaches to money. Perhaps, Miss Marple mused, Gregory had grown desperate, seeking to gain control of the estate by removing his wife from the picture. Then there was Lord Jonathan, Sir Gregory's cousin. He had been in the drawing room with Gregory when the crash was heard, but his alibi was too neat, almost too perfect. Miss Marple had sensed something was off in his responses, particularly when she had asked him about the time leading up to the discovery of Lady Evelyn's body. He had been calm, almost too calm for someone involved in a tragedy. Lord Jonathan had a strong connection to the estate, though perhaps not as strong as Gregory's. Still, the inheritance was a powerful motivator. Would he have stood to gain more than he let on if Lady Evelyn were out of the way? And had he perhaps seized an opportunity when the moment presented itself? The maid, Agnes, was another enigma. Her account had been the most straightforward, yet something in her tone had made Miss Marple pause. Agnes had been the one to notice Sir Gregory outside the study, just before the body had been discovered. She had described his behaviour as strange, though she hadn't elaborated further. It was a small observation, but one that suggested an unease that Miss Marple found intriguing. Agnes had grown up in the manor, devoted to Lady Evelyn, and had witnessed the tensions between the couple firsthand. Could she have known more than she let on? Had she been drawn into a situation she wasn't ready to face? And then there was Mrs. Frobisher, the housekeeper. She was the one who had discovered Lady Evelyn's body, but her behaviour had been the most difficult to read. Her nervousness had been evident, yes, but her reactions also seemed too rehearsed, as if she had been expecting to be questioned. When Miss Marple had asked her about the strange shadow seen near the study window, Mrs. Frobisher had seemed almost too eager to share the detail. It could have been a genuine observation, but the housekeeper's willingness to offer it up so freely made Miss Marple wonder if she wasn't hiding something more. Did she know more about the relationships within the house than she had let on? Was she perhaps protecting someone or even herself by remaining quiet? As Miss Marple sorted through the alibis and contradictions, she realized the complexity of the situation was only deepening. There were so many potential motives at play, each as tangled as the last. Greed seemed to be the most obvious, but jealousy and revenge could be just as powerful driving forces. The subtle tensions between Lady Evelyn and those closest to her, her husband, her cousin, her maid, hinted at personal betrayals, secrets that had festered beneath the surface for far too long. Miss Marple knew the truth would not come from simply examining the facts. It was the emotions, the undercurrents between the people in this house that would eventually reveal the full story. The question, then, was not just who had the motive, but who had the opportunity. Every suspect had an angle, but not all of them had the chance to strike. She needed to look beyond the obvious. She stood, moving slowly across the room as her mind continued to churn through the details. It was time to bring them all together again. The clock was ticking, and Miss Marple could feel the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. But she wasn't quite ready to expose everything just yet. There were still questions to be answered, still contradictions to be explored. Turning to the group, she addressed them once more. "I've spent the afternoon listening to all of you," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to settle over the room. "And I must admit, I'm more confused now than I was before. Each of you has a reason, an opportunity, to be involved in this tragedy, but none of your stories seem to fit together quite right. Perhaps the truth is hiding in the smallest of details, things we've overlooked." Her eyes lingered on each suspect in turn, watching their reactions closely. "We will continue our investigation tomorrow, but I suggest you all take a moment to think carefully about your next words. The truth, after all, has a way of coming out, no matter how well it's concealed." She paused, allowing the tension to build in the room before adding, "And when it does, it will expose not only the killer, but the reasons behind it." As she turned to leave, she could feel the eyes of every person in the room following her. The investigation had reached its boiling point, and Miss Marple knew the end was drawing near. But the final pieces of the puzzle still eluded her. For now, though, she was content to wait. The maze of motives was intricate, but it was a maze she was determined to navigate to its end. The next day, the atmosphere at Ashbury Manor had shifted. The sun had risen early, casting a pale golden light over the sprawling estate. But inside, the tension was palpable. The investigation seemed to be reaching a crucial juncture, and Miss Marple had the sense that they were on the verge of something important, though she still couldn't quite place what that was. Inspector Grayson had made a rather public proclamation. A breakthrough had been made. A piece of evidence had come to light, one that seemed to finally confirm their suspicions. Early in the morning, Mrs. Frobisher, the housekeeper, had reported finding an unusual object under the floorboard of the study, an antique pocket watch, one that belonged to Sir Gregory. It was a significant find, given that Sir Gregory had claimed not to have seen the watch since the previous day. The item had no other explanation for being hidden beneath the floorboard, except for one. It seemed to implicate him. It was the type of evidence that could solve a case, the kind of tangible clue that would tie together the loose ends. With an air of triumph, Inspector Grayson had called the suspects together in the drawing room once again, announcing that the investigation had come to a close. The watch, he declared, had been a clear piece of evidence that linked Sir Gregory to the crime. With its discovery, it was now evident that he had staged the scene to make the death look like an accident, hoping to cover up a deliberate act of violence. The case, as far as he was concerned, was solved. Sir Gregory, pale and shaking, had been arrested immediately. There were few words spoken as he was escorted from the room, but Miss Marple caught a brief flicker in his eyes as he passed. Something like a flicker of disbelief, or perhaps even relief. It was hard to tell. The authorities quickly set to work, finalizing the paperwork for Sir Gregory's arrest, with several officers beginning to make arrangements for his transfer to a nearby holding cell. Grayson, with the satisfaction of a man who believed the case was solved, seemed ready to put it all behind him. The room, once full of tension, now seemed to breathe more easily. The weight of the mystery had been lifted. The killer had been caught. Yet, for Miss Marple, a nagging feeling lingered. The story felt too neat, too clean, and there was something about the way Sir Gregory had reacted, something she couldn't place, that unsettled her. She had seen enough cases to know that things were rarely as simple as they seemed, especially when there was too much certainty. She stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the mantel. Her mind raced over the events of the past few days, each detail, each nuance of behavior that didn't fit the established narrative. She could feel the pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite align, like cracks in an otherwise solid structure. Her thoughts turned to the pocket watch. Yes, it was damning, but Miss Marple had always known that circumstantial evidence could sometimes be more misleading than helpful. The watch could have been placed there by anyone. Perhaps it was an attempt to frame Sir Gregory. The timing seemed too convenient, too much of an easy answer. Then there was the manner in which the authorities had presented the evidence. They hadn't even considered the possibility that someone might have planted the watch, or that it could have been hidden for an entirely different reason. They were quick to jump to conclusions, to fit the evidence to their assumptions. But Miss Marple wasn't convinced. She glanced toward the window where the figures of the authorities moved about, preparing for Sir Gregory's departure. Her eyes flicked back to the rest of the room where the suspects now lingered, their faces a mixture of relief and suspicion. Lord Jonathan was the first to speak, his voice smooth, though there was an edge to it that suggested he was far from content with how the case had concluded. "Well, that's that then," he said with a forced smile. "It's all been sorted out, hasn't it? It was Gregory, after all." Mrs. Frobisher nodded, but her eyes, though downcast, seemed to glimmer with something else, something darker, perhaps even guilty. Miss Marple caught the way her fingers twitched as she smoothed her dress, a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture. Agnes, standing quietly by the door, had the faintest look of uncertainty in her eyes. Miss Marple watched her closely. The maid had been one of the most enigmatic figures in the case. She had seemed almost too passive in the face of everything that had happened. Was it relief she felt now, or guilt? As the others continued to speak, amongst themselves, Miss Marple's thoughts returned once more to the pocket watch. It had been found under the floorboards, yes, but why had it been hidden there? Sir Gregory had been quick to explain that he hadn't seen it since the day before, but Miss Marple was starting to wonder if that was true. He could have dropped it, sure, but why would he have done so in a place so carefully concealed? And why hadn't it been discovered earlier, when the study had been searched after Lady Evelyn's death? Could someone have hidden it there after? The fact framing him? She turned her attention back to the others. The room had grown quieter, and Miss Marple felt the weight of their collective gaze. Her mind sharpened as she began to sift through the others' reactions. Mrs. Frobisher, with her strange eagerness to offer details, had been far too ready to report the discovery of the watch. Agnes, who had made the strange observation of Sir Gregory near the study window, had seemed almost too quick to reveal that information to Miss Marple. And Lord Jonathan, always so composed, had been the first to speak out in favour of a swift conclusion. Was it possible, Miss Marple wondered, that they were all playing their parts in a carefully crafted narrative? A narrative that had been designed to point the finger squarely at Sir Gregory, one that would not only give them the satisfaction of a resolution, but also protect whoever truly stood behind the crime. Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of the hunt rise within her. She had seen this before. The false victory that came from settling for an easy answer, the rush to declare closure before all the facts were known. The real criminal, she was sure, had not been caught. "I'm afraid," Miss Marple said, breaking the silence. her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation, "that the case is not as closed as some of you may think." The room fell still. Every eye turned to her, each of the suspects looking caught between curiosity and unease. "I've been over the evidence, and something doesn't sit right," Miss Marple continued, her gaze unwavering. "I believe there is more to this case than meets the eye. Sir Gregory might not be the one we should be focusing on at all. In fact, I'm certain the true culprit is still in this very room." A collective breath seemed to be held as Miss Marple stood firm, her mind already moving toward the next step. The pieces were starting to shift once again, and she was ready to follow them wherever they might lead. The false victory was only the beginning. Now the real work would begin. The silence in the room was thick, like the air just before a storm, as Miss Marple's words hung in the air. She had spoken with quiet authority, but the look in her eyes was one of unshakable certainty. She had thrown the investigation into chaos again, shattering the fragile resolution the authorities had so eagerly clung to. "Perhaps you're right," Inspector Grayson finally said, his voice tinged with annoyance, but betraying a hint of uncertainty. "But what exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple? That the evidence we've gathered is somehow fabricated, or that we've misjudged Sir Gregory entirely?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She simply watched him, her fingers gently drumming on the back of her chair. She was allowing him and the rest of them to wrestle with her words. She had no intention of making it easy for anyone. "No," Miss Marple said finally, her voice calm but decisive. "What I'm suggesting is that the case we're investigating isn't isolated. It's connected to something from the past, something none of you has thought to question." The room shifted uncomfortably. The suspicion and unease that had once been a mere undercurrent now surged to the surface. The suspects exchanged glances, their faces betraying their growing anxiety. "The past?" Agnes, the maid, asked quietly. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's gaze softened as she turned toward the young woman, sensing her growing distress. "You see, Agnes, when I first arrived at Ashbury Manor, I didn't know much about Lady Evelyn's life before her marriage, but now, looking at everything that's happened, I believe the answer lies in a far older connection than any of us anticipated." Agnes shifted on her feet, her eyes wide. Miss Marple could see that the maid's breath had quickened. Perhaps it was the mere suggestion of something from Lady Evelyn's past, or perhaps it was something more. Lord Jonathan cleared his throat, his face flushed with the tension of the moment. "This is all very intriguing, Miss Marple, but I fail to see how something from the past has any bearing on the current investigation. Lady Evelyn's death was a tragedy, certainly, but it's hardly a matter of historical intrigue." Miss Marple, however, paid him no mind. Her thoughts were already tracing a line back through the years, through the labyrinth of old debts, forgotten secrets, and family histories that had not been aired in decades. She had never believed in coincidences, and the more she thought about the case, the more she realized that the key to understanding Lady Evelyn's murder lay hidden in the family's history. She turned back to Inspector Grayson. "There's a detail I've overlooked until now. One that connects not only Sir Gregory, but all of you. In a way no one expected." The inspector's brows furrowed, a sign that he was listening intently. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the window, her eyes fixed on the sprawling gardens outside. Lady Evelyn's marriage to Sir Gregory wasn't the simple union it appeared to be. In fact, there were complications. Lady Evelyn had a past that neither her husband nor her cousin Lord Jonathan had ever been willing to discuss. The room grew still. No one spoke for a moment. The truth Miss Marple had suggested seemed to ripple through the group, unsettling everyone in its wake. What past? Lord Jonathan's voice was sharp now, a mix of defensiveness and rising suspicion. Lady Evelyn was once engaged to another man, an old suitor from her youth, Miss Marple said. His name was Charles Ashford, and he was a man with a reputation that carried more than a hint of danger. They were deeply in love, but their engagement ended abruptly when Charles was involved in a scandal, one that, if I recall correctly, had its roots in dishonesty and financial ruin. She paused, watching their reactions carefully. She could see the shifting expressions, the discomfort in their eyes. The past, it seemed, was not something that any of them had wanted to revisit. Lady Evelyn's family had pressured her to break off the engagement, Miss Marple continued, and she never spoke of Ashford again. But I believe that this was more than just a simple love lost. The Ashford family was notorious for their secrets, and Charles Ashford himself disappeared shortly after the scandal, vanishing without a trace. What no one knew, though, was that Charles had been keeping a ledger, a record of debts, secrets, and illicit transactions that could have ruined many families, including Lady Evelyn's. The revelation hung in the air, the weight of it undeniable. The connections were suddenly becoming clearer, like the pieces of a puzzle shifting into place. Lady Evelyn's past had been far more complicated than anyone had imagined, and now Miss Marple realized it was becoming inextricably linked to the present. Lord Jonathan's face went pale. He seemed to struggle for words. "Are you suggesting that the Ashford family is involved in my cousin's death?" he demanded. "No," Miss Marple replied calmly. "But I do believe someone who was connected to that past is. Someone who knew Lady Evelyn's secret, and someone who had a reason to make sure it stayed hidden." She turned to Sir Gregory, who had remained silent until now, his eyes narrowed in confusion. "You see, Sir Gregory," she continued, "you weren't the only one with a motive to remove Lady Evelyn from this world. The person who killed her may have been trying to cover up something from the past, something that threatened to resurface. And that something, I believe, is the ledger Charles Ashford kept." Miss Marple paused, letting the silence stretch. Then she looked back toward the others. "You see, Charles Ashford wasn't entirely gone. He returned to Ashbury Manor, under another name years later, and someone here, someone in this room, is directly connected to him." The tension in the room escalated. It was clear now that the investigation had taken a turn no one had expected. Miss Marple had unearthed something that no one had dared to consider, something that tied the present to a long-buried secret. Agnes, now visibly shaken, took a step forward. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. I've never heard of any ledger." Miss Marple's eyes softened as she met the maid's gaze. "Of course not, Agnes. But your mother, she was a servant here years ago, wasn't she? And she worked for Lady Evelyn's family before the marriage. She knew Charles Ashford well, didn't she?" The realization hit Agnes like a blow, her face paling as her lips parted in shock. Miss Marple could see the faintest tremor in her hands as she clasped them in front of her. "Your mother kept the secret, didn't she?" Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. "And now you're the one who's been trying to keep it buried, trying to protect someone." or perhaps even yourself. Agnes's eyes darted nervously between the others, her breath shallow. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The truth was out now, and Miss Marple had uncovered the shadow that stretched all the way from the past into the present. The past, it seemed, had finally come home to roost. The tension in the room remained thick, the air heavy with unspoken truths. Agnes was frozen, her face an odd mixture of shock and guilt. Miss Marple's eyes were unwavering, a quiet determination behind her gaze. The maid's silence was deafening, as though she were grappling with something deep inside herself, some decision on whether to speak or remain silent. The others, too, seemed stunned. Lord Jonathan, Mrs. Frobisher, and even Sir Gregory were all fixated on Agnes, the maid who had inadvertently become the key to unlocking the past. The room was a trap of stillness, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Miss Marple broke the silence. "Agnes, I don't believe you meant to harm anyone, but I do believe you've been protecting someone who has been hiding in the shadows for years." Agnes looked at her, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the right words. Her hands twisted together, the knuckles pale from the pressure. Finally, her voice came, barely a whisper. I didn't want to, Miss Marple. I didn't know what to do. It's not just my mother's secret. It's mine, too." The revelation struck like a hammer, but Miss Marple didn't flinch. She had expected it in a way. There was no need to rush now. The truth would come, in its own time. Instead, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, observing Agnes with quiet interest. "Tell me, Agnes," she said softly, "what exactly did your mother know about Charles Ashford, and why did she keep that ledger?" Agnes flinched. She opened her mouth to speak, but then closed it again, as if her tongue were heavy with the burden of her words. It was clear she was stalling, but Miss Marple had expected no less. The game wasn't over yet, and the maid still held pieces of the puzzle that hadn't yet fallen into place. Miss Marple wasn't finished. "You've been trying to protect someone, haven't you? But it's not just your mother's secret. You're shielding. There's someone else who is still in danger, and I'm certain you know who it is." Agnes stared at her, her eyes wide with panic. No, I don't." But Miss Marple's sharp eyes saw the flicker. The moment of hesitation, the minute crack in the facade. It was subtle, but it was enough. "You're lying," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice sharp as a knife. "You do know who it is, and now we're going to get to the truth." Agnes's shoulders sagged, the fight going out of her. "I can't," she whispered. I promised I wouldn't say. I swore." Miss Marple tilted her head, considering the maid's words carefully. Then she leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You know, Agnes, when people make promises like that, it's usually because they're trying to protect someone who holds power over them. Someone who could ruin their lives if they revealed the truth." Agnes flinched again, and for the first time, she met Miss Marple's gaze directly. "I didn't have a choice," she said in a tremulous voice. "He made me promise. Or else, he said he'd... Who?" Miss Marple pressed, her voice gentle but insistent. Agnes's lips quivered. "Mr. Ashford, Charles Ashford's son. He's here. He's been here all along." The room fell into utter silence, save for the sound of collective breaths being drawn in sharply. Agnes's admission was the key that turned everything upside down, Charles Ashford's son. Miss Marple's mind raced. So it was true. The family secret had never truly been buried, and now generations of lies were coming to light. The son of the man whose actions had once shattered Lady Evelyn's youth had returned to Ashbury Manor. No wonder the past had felt so alive. No wonder it had lingered in the air like a shadow, threatening to unearth something dangerous. Where is he now? Miss Marple asked, her voice steady, though her mind was already turning, processing every new detail. Agnes hesitated, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. I don't know where he is now, but he was here in the house. I saw him last night, just after Lady Evelyn's death. He told me to stay quiet. A cold shiver ran down Miss Marple's spine. So the son of Charles Ashford had returned, not just to settle old scores, but to erase any trace of his family's involvement in the dark history that had plagued the Ashford name. The ledger, the very one that could destroy everything, was the key. Whoever had it would hold the power to unravel the secrets that had long been buried. Miss Marple stood, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at the group. I believe it's time we looked at this house in a new light, she said, her voice cool with resolve. There's something you've all missed, something hidden right beneath your noses. Inspector Grayson blinked, still processing Agnes's confession. What do you mean, Miss Marple? I mean, she said, turning her sharp gaze back to the room, that the true culprit is still among us. The son of Charles Ashford never left Ashbury Manor, and I intend to prove it. Miss Marple moved to the door, pausing as she looked back at the assembled suspects. I'm going to conduct an experiment, she said, her voice steady. A simple test, really. I will give each of you an opportunity to reveal your true feelings, and in doing so, one of you will betray yourself. Before anyone could protest or ask her to elaborate, Miss Marple left the room, her mind already focused on the task ahead. There were details yet to be uncovered, details that only an unconventional approach could bring to light. Her method was simple, yet effective. As she made her way through the manor, she observed each of the rooms with a keen, almost predatory eye. The study where Lady Evelyn had been found, the drawing room where they had gathered, the small library where Mrs. Frobisher had spent much of her time. Miss Marple knew that the house held more than it let on. The hidden chambers, the secret spaces within the walls. They all had a role to play in the mystery that was unraveling before her. When she finally returned to the drawing room, she found the suspects waiting, their eyes full of uncertainty. She raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. I've made arrangements, Miss Marple said, her voice sharp and clear. Each of you will undergo a simple task, a test, if you will, and through it you will reveal your true nature. The room seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple began her experiment. The first to step forward was Mrs. Frobisher, whose hands trembled slightly as she reached for the small envelope Miss Marple held out. The test, however, wasn't as it appeared. It wasn't a test of character or trust, it was a test of pressure. Miss Marple had carefully crafted a situation in which each person's reaction to the unexpected would expose their true role in this tangled web of deceit. As Mrs. Frobisher held the envelope, her fingers were visibly tight, her gaze flickering nervously to the others. And then, in that fleeting moment of hesitation, Miss Marple caught the subtle crack. Mrs. Frobisher wasn't just nervous. She was hiding something. The trap had been set. And now the web of deception was about to unravel, one small reveal at a time. The air in the drawing room was thick with tension as Miss Marple observed the reactions of the suspects, her mind sharp and calculating. The subtle tremor in Mrs. Frobisher's fingers had not gone unnoticed. Her unease spoke volumes, as did the fleeting glance she had exchanged with Lord Jonathan when the envelope was passed around. But Miss Marple held her ground, watching carefully, knowing that it was only a matter of time before one of them would slip. Just as she was about to make her next move, the door to the drawing room opened with a creak, drawing everyone's attention. Agnes stepped in, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. She was holding something in her hands, something small, but precious. "Miss Marple," she said breathlessly, her voice tight with anxiety, "I need to tell you something." Before Agnes could continue, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Inspector Grayson appeared in the doorway, his face drawn with concern. He looked at Agnes, then at Miss Marple, his brow furrowing as he noticed the tension in the room. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low. Agnes took a hesitant step forward. "I found it, Miss Marple," she whispered, barely able to control the tremor in her voice. "I found the ledger." The room fell silent. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as she locked eyes with Agnes. This was it, the piece they had all been searching for. The ledger that could unravel the web of lies, that could expose the truth behind Lady Evelyn's death, the Ashford family's involvement, and all the secrets buried deep within Ashbury Manor. But before she could speak, the room was plunged into chaos. A loud crash from the hallway startled everyone, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps and muffled voices. Inspector Grayson's hand flew to his waist, instinctively reaching for his firearm. But before anyone could react, Agnes screamed. The ledger, the very one they had just learned about, had vanished from her hands. It was as if it had evaporated into thin air. Miss Marple's mind raced. Someone had stolen it. Someone had acted swiftly and silently, taking the evidence that could break the case wide open. She turned to face Agnes, who stood frozen, her hands outstretched, as if trying to hold on to something invisible. I didn't see who took it," Agnes stammered, her face pale and trembling. "It was there, and then it was gone." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the room. The suspects were still visibly shaken by the sudden commotion, but none of them seemed to have moved. Could one of them have taken the ledger? Had they acted alone, or was there someone else in the manor working in the shadows? "Inspector Grayson," Miss Marple said sharply, her voice carrying an edge of authority. "We need to search the house, now. Whoever took that ledger is still here, and they won't stop until the truth is buried." Grayson nodded grimly and motioned for his officers to begin searching the premises, but Miss Marple knew it wasn't enough to simply look for the ledger. They needed to understand why it had been taken and who had taken it. The stakes had just risen, and the danger was no longer just theoretical. It was real, immediate, and growing with every passing minute. "Agnes," Miss Marple said softly, turning to the maid, "think carefully. Where were you when the ledger disappeared? Did you see anyone leave the room?" Agnes's eyes were wide with confusion, her lips trembling as she shook her head. I don't know, Miss Marple. It was just there in my hands. And then I heard the crash, and when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't see anyone." Her voice faltered. Think harder, Agnes, Miss Marple urged gently but firmly. Anyone could have taken it, but there may be something you missed. A shadow, a movement, a glance, anything could help us. Agnes looked down, biting her lip as she tried to recall the moment, but it was as if her mind was struggling to focus. The terror in her eyes was palpable, and Miss Marple realized that she wasn't lying. Agnes genuinely didn't know who had taken the ledger, but that didn't mean the answers weren't out there. Miss Marple glanced at the others, noting the subtle but unmistakable discomfort in their faces. Lord Jonathan, Mrs. Frobisher, even Sir Gregory. They were all playing their parts, trying to appear innocent, but their reactions were telling a different story. The theft of the ledger had put them all on edge, and Miss Marple could sense it. Then something caught her attention. It was small, a fleeting detail, but it struck her nonetheless. Mrs. Frobisher had taken a single step toward the door, and she was holding something tightly in her hand, hidden behind her back. "Mrs. Frobisher," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but cutting through the tension, "would you mind showing me your hands?" The room fell deathly silent as all eyes turned to the older woman, who froze, her fingers curling into a fist behind her back. Her face had gone pale, and her lips pressed together in a thin line. The nervous glances exchanged between her and Lord Jonathan were enough to raise suspicion in Miss Marple's mind. "I don't know what you mean," Mrs. Frobisher said, her voice tight, but Miss Marple could see the lie in her eyes. "I insist," Miss Marple said firmly, taking a step toward the woman. "Please, show me your hands." Reluctantly, Mrs. Frobisher slowly extended her arms, and Miss Marple's gaze dropped to her clenched fists. She knew something was wrong. With a swift motion, she reached forward and pried open Mrs. Frobisher's hand. There, nestled between her fingers, was a small scrap of paper, torn and weathered with age. Miss Marple's heart sank as she held it up for everyone to see. It was a page from the ledger. The same ledger that had disappeared moments before. The room exploded with shocked gasps, and Mrs. Frobisher took an involuntary step back, her eyes wide with panic. "Where did you find this?" Miss Marple demanded, her voice cold. I didn't take it," Mrs. Frobisher cried. But there was no convincing anyone now. The evidence was undeniable. She had been hiding it, and the question was why. And then it hit Miss Marple. The scrap of paper was old, much older than any of the documents they had seen from the ledger. It was from a time when Charles Ashford had been alive, and it wasn't just any page. It was a crucial one, a piece that would lead them directly to the heart of the mystery. "Who else is involved, Mrs. Frobisher?" Miss Marple pressed. "You're not acting alone, are you? Someone is working with you. Someone has gone to great lengths to keep this hidden." The fear in Mrs. Frobisher's eyes was the only answer Miss Marple needed. The stakes had indeed risen. The true mastermind behind Lady Evelyn's death and the theft of the ledger was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. But Miss Marple wasn't about to let that happen. The game was far from over, and now, more than ever, she was determined to uncover the truth no matter where it led. The tension in the room was palpable, each person in the drawing room aware of the gravity of the moment. Miss Marple held the scrap of paper in her hand, examining it closely, her mind already working to unravel its significance. The other guests were silent, each of them now casting wary glances at Mrs. Frobisher, who was visibly trembling in her seat. But just as Miss Marple was about to question her further, a new sound, sharp and unmistakable, sliced through the air. It was a gunshot. For a brief moment, Time seemed to freeze. The room went deathly still as everyone turned toward the hallway. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her instincts immediately alert. She dropped the paper onto the table and stepped swiftly toward the door, motioning for the others to follow. Inspector. Grayson was already moving, his hand reaching for his gun as he rushed down the hall. The others trailed behind, but it was Miss Marple who moved with an uncanny precision, her mind already working through the possibilities. The shot had come from the direction of the library, a place where no one had been for hours. It could only mean one thing: another crime was unfolding, and the murderer was already 2 steps ahead of them. As Miss Marple reached the library door, she hesitated just for a moment. Then, without a word, she flung it open. The scene inside was a horrific sight. Lord Jonathan Ashford lay on the floor, his body contorted unnaturally, a dark stain spreading across the carpet beneath him. His eyes were wide open, his expression frozen in shock. The room, however, was eerily quiet, with no signs of struggle, only the unmistakable mark of violence. A gun lay nearby, but it was unclear whether he had been the one to pull the trigger, or if it had been planted. Inspector Grayson knelt beside the body, his face grim. He checked for a pulse, but knew, even before his fingers touched the cold skin, that it was too late. The second murder had occurred with terrifying swiftness, and the fact that it had happened so close to them only deepened the mystery. Miss Marple's gaze shifted, taking in the details of the room. The faintest trace of something odd caught her attention: a glass of brandy on the mantelpiece, its contents undisturbed. It wasn't unusual for Lord Jonathan to have a drink, but what struck Miss Marple was the way the glass was placed, exactly in the middle of the mantel, as if it had been carefully positioned. It didn't feel right. Her mind worked quickly, a carefully staged scene, the shot too deliberate. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing, and they had done it under the watchful eyes of the guests. "Everyone stay back," Inspector Grayson barked, his voice low but commanding as he began his examination of the crime scene. "This place is a crime scene now. We need to secure the area before anyone touches anything." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She turned slowly, scanning the faces of those who had followed her into the room. Agnes was standing by the door, her hands clasped in front of her, her face pale with shock. Mrs. Frobisher looked as though she were about to faint, clutching her shawl to her chest. Sir Gregory, ever stoic, stood near the window, his gaze distant, but Miss Marple knew better than to believe he was unaffected. The room felt as though it were closing in on her, but she kept her composure. She knew there was more to this crime than met the eye. Lord Jonathan had been killed with an efficiency that hinted at careful planning, and the fact that it had happened so soon after the theft of the ledger only heightened her suspicions. "Missy Marple," Inspector Grayson said quietly, stepping up beside her. "What do you make of this?" Miss Marple's eyes flicked from the body to the surroundings. There was no obvious motive for Lord Jonathan's death, not like the tangled web of connections that surrounded Lady Evelyn's murder. But then, an uncomfortable thought crossed her mind. What if this was never about money or revenge? She took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. "I believe," she said softly, "that the person who killed Lord Jonathan is not just trying to silence a witness, but is actively trying to erase any trace of the truth." Grayson's brow furrowed in confusion, but Miss Marple did not explain further. Instead, she moved toward the desk, her eyes scanning the papers scattered on it. She flipped through them methodically, looking for any clue, any hint that could tie this murder to the larger puzzle. But nothing appeared to fit. The room grew colder as the minutes passed. Outside, the rain had begun to fall again, a soft, steady patter that seemed to mirror the deepening sense of urgency. Miss Marple turned back to Grayson, her eyes sharp with resolve. "We need to move quickly," she said. "The killer is still here, and if we're not careful, they'll strike. Again, whoever is behind this knows how to cover their tracks, and we're running out of time." Inspector Grayson nodded, his face a mix of frustration and determination. He turned to his officers, barking orders to seal off the house, but Miss Marple could sense that even now something was amiss. She wasn't sure why, but the feeling that the killer was watching them from the shadows had never been stronger. The game had shifted, and now they were no longer chasing clues. They were trying to stop the next murder before it happened. And that, Miss Marple realized with growing clarity, was exactly what the killer wanted. They were no longer playing by the rules. They had set a trap, and Miss Marple had unknowingly walked straight into it. As Grayson moved to speak with the others, Miss Marple turned toward the hallway, her thoughts racing. There was something she had missed earlier, something that didn't sit right. She had been so focused on the ledger, the stolen evidence, and the motives of each suspect, but now she wondered, what if the answer was hiding in plain sight? She turned back to the room, her eyes sweeping across the faces of the remaining suspects. Someone in this house was hiding more than one crime. And soon, Miss Marple would uncover the one piece of the puzzle that could stop the next murder, before it was too late. Miss Marple stood in the corner of the room, her gaze sweeping over the others, her mind racing. The sense of urgency had grown, now that another life had been taken, and the killer was still among them. Despite the storm of emotions and the chaos that gripped the house, one thing was clear to her. The pieces of this puzzle were slowly coming together, and the pattern was emerging. If only she could catch it. She leaned against the mantelpiece, her mind tracing back through the moments that had led them here. Lord Jonathan's death had thrown them all off course, but Miss Marple wasn't one to be easily distracted. While Inspector Grayson dealt with the others, she remained vigilant, thinking over the events that had transpired. There was one thing that kept niggling at her, one thing that had seemed too insignificant to notice at first, but now stood out, like a bright red thread in a tapestry of confusion. It was the glass of brandy, placed so carefully on the mantelpiece. Miss Marple had a knack for seeing patterns that others missed, especially in moments of tension. At first she'd been distracted by the obvious signs of violence, the position of the body, the gun, the blood. But now, with the scene burned into her mind, she could see what had been hidden. The glass of brandy had been placed deliberately, almost as though it was meant to be noticed. But it wasn't just its position that mattered. It was the fact that it had been untouched. Lord Jonathan had been known to enjoy his evening drink, but it had been left there, perfectly still, untouched by anyone. A small detail, easily overlooked by most, but Miss Marple knew it had meaning. There had been no sign of struggle in the room, no chaotic search for something, no indication that a confrontation had taken place. Instead, it seemed almost as though Lord Jonathan had known exactly what was coming. But why? And who had done it? She turned, scanning the room again, but this time her eyes were focused on the other objects, the things that had seemed out of place, trivial in the midst of the drama. She stepped over to the desk where Lord Jonathan had kept his personal Papers. The mess of papers seemed more like an attempt to stage a hurried search rather than a truly chaotic scene. Then, her gaze fell upon a small item tucked away in the corner. A broken piece of a letter opener. It was a trivial thing, but it struck her with sudden clarity. She bent down, picking it up delicately, her fingers tracing its edges. This wasn't just a piece of a letter opener, it was a clue. But what was it doing there in the midst of this mess? She had already examined the other objects in the room, but now, with the shard in her hand, everything clicked into place. Lord. Jonathan had been a man who took great care in organizing his affairs. A broken letter opener, carelessly left behind, didn't fit the scene. It spoke of someone else's presence, someone who had tried to make it appear like a simple crime, of opportunity when it was anything but. A low murmur broke through her thoughts. She turned to see Sir Gregory standing near the door, his eyes downcast. He looked almost guilty, as though he had been caught in some misdeed. "Miss Marple," he said softly, his voice betraying no emotion. "We've questioned everyone again. It seems we're no closer to finding the killer." But she wasn't listening to him. She was still holding the letter opener shard, her mind working faster than ever. The idea that she'd missed something so obvious before was frustrating. The brandy glass, the broken object. These things didn't fit. Why had they been left behind, discarded as if they didn't matter? Her mind jumped to a startling realization. The letter opener. It had to be connected to the original murder. Lady Evelyn had been stabbed with something similar. The same weapon? Or was this a deliberate attempt to throw them off the scent? Her thoughts were interrupted when she noticed the peculiar way Mrs. Frobisher was standing. The woman was fidgeting, nervously, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl, her eyes darting to the door. She had been strangely quiet ever since they entered the library, as though she were waiting for something, waiting for the moment to pass. Miss Marple stepped toward her. "Mrs. Frobisher," she said gently, her voice calm yet firm, "I believe we have not yet uncovered everything. What is it that you're not telling us?" The woman froze, her face paling further, but then she gave a small, hesitant nod. "It's nothing," she murmured quickly. "Just nerves." "I'm sorry, really, I am." But Miss Marple wasn't convinced. There was more to this woman's reaction than simple nerves. She had seen it before, a slip, a crack in the facade that revealed more than a person intended. She watched the woman for another long moment, noting the way her eyes flickered toward the desk, where the broken letter opener had been found. Mrs. Frobisher's gaze lingered for just an instant longer than necessary, a subconscious betrayal that was hard to ignore. As if on cue, Miss Marple turned back to the desk. It was there that the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Mrs. Frobisher had been in the library earlier, perhaps looking for something, and in her rush had dropped the letter opener in the scuffle. The details of the crime were starting to make sense, but there was still a lingering doubt, a question that remained unanswered. Was Mrs. Frobisher acting alone, or was someone else manipulating her? Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, thinking about all the other details. The glass of brandy, the broken opener, the hidden motives lurking just beneath the surface. The pattern was now clear. There was more to the situation than a simple crime of passion, more than mere jealousy or greed. This crime had its roots in the past, and the present was merely a continuation of an old, unfinished story. And as Miss Marple looked around the room, She knew she was finally close to uncovering the truth behind the deadly pattern that had emerged. Miss Marple stepped back from the desk, the pieces finally falling into place in her mind. The broken letter opener, the untouched glass of brandy, the strange reactions from the suspects. It was all starting to make sense. The answers had been hidden in plain sight, but now that she saw the full picture, the truth was more shocking than she could have ever anticipated. She turned to the others, her eyes scanning their faces as they stood in the room. Each one of them seemed to be carrying the weight of suspicion, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered longest on Mrs. Frobisher. The woman's nervousness had been a tell. She was hiding something. But it wasn't just about the letter opener or the odd details that had stood out to Miss Marple. It was deeper than that. "Mrs. Frobisher," Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "You've been trying very hard to cover something up, but it isn't just a broken object or a misstep in the night's events that you're hiding, is it?" The woman flinched, her eyes darting around the room as if seeking an escape. But she was cornered. Miss Marple could see the subtle tremble in her hands, the way her breath quickened. It was not fear of the law that gripped her, but something far darker. "Please, Miss Marple," Mrs. Frobisher whispered, her voice cracking. "You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. It wasn't supposed to go so far." "Miss..." Marple took a step closer, her mind calculating each word carefully. "Tell me what you're hiding, Mrs. Frobisher. Tell me what you truly fear." The woman's eyes filled with a mix of desperation and resignation. She glanced at the others in the room, then down at her feet, her gaze unfocused. The tension in the air was palpable as Miss Marple waited for the confession to spill forth. It came at last, in a broken whisper. It wasn't just Jonathan. It was his secret, the one he was going to reveal, the one we all thought we could bury. The room seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple listened intently. "What secret, Mrs. Frobisher?" Mrs. Frobisher's voice dropped even lower. "Years ago, Jonathan had an affair with someone close to all of us, a family member. But it wasn't just an affair. It was about something else, something more dangerous. He knew too much. He'd found out things that were never meant to see the light of day. He had the power to destroy everything." Miss Marple's mind raced. The affair, the secret. She had suspected as much, but now it was clearer. The motive wasn't just a lover's quarrel or a desire for money. It was about exposure, the crumbling of everything these people had built. Mrs. Frobisher's eyes darted nervously, and Miss Marple realized something crucial. Who was the other person involved? Miss Marple asked, her voice unwavering. Mrs. Frobisher hesitated, her lips trembling. It was Gregory, Sir Gregory, Jonathan's own brother. They were involved, and Jonathan had the proof. He was planning to expose everything, the affair, the lies, the corruption. He was going to bring it all to light, and Gregory couldn't let that happen. The realization hit Miss Marple like a sudden thunderclap. The true motive was revealed, but it was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. It wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a carefully planned attempt to preserve a carefully constructed facade, a life built on lies, deceit, and manipulation. Sir Gregory's face had turned pale, his expression now one of terror. He looked as if he were about to collapse under the weight of his own guilt. Miss Marple saw the coldness in his eyes, the way he reacted to the revelation with an unnatural calm. It wasn't fear he felt. It was the realization that his deepest secret was now exposed. "Gregory," Miss Marple said, her voice firm. "You couldn't allow Jonathan to ruin everything, could you? You were willing to do anything to keep the truth from coming out. You killed your brother to protect the life you had built." Gregory's lips twisted into a thin, tight smile, his voice low but steady. "You don't understand. I had no choice. Jonathan was going to destroy us all, destroy everything we had worked for. He had the power to tear it all apart. And if that meant eliminating him, then so be it." Miss Marple felt a chill creep down her spine. There it was, the villain's true psychology, exposed for all to see. A man willing to sacrifice his own blood to protect his own reputation and the world he had carefully constructed. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about power either. It was about preserving the illusion of control, of perfection. The secret Jonathan had discovered, the affair with his own brother's wife, threatened to bring down the entire structure they had built. Gregory's willingness to murder to keep it hidden spoke to a cold, ruthless desperation that Miss Marple had encountered only rarely in her years of solving mysteries. But now the puzzle was complete. The threads of the crime, so tangled at first, were drawn together with chilling clarity. Sir Gregory had planned the murder meticulously. He had used Mrs. Frobisher as an unwitting pawn, distracting everyone with her nervous behavior and false confessions while he carefully covered his tracks. He had manipulated the others, spinning the illusion of a tragic accident, knowing that it would never be enough to keep the truth from coming out. The twisted irony was not lost on Miss Marple. Gregory had never truly understood what his brother had been after. Jonathan had not wanted to destroy Gregory's life. He had simply wanted to ensure that the truth was known. But in trying to bury it, Gregory had sealed his own fate. As Miss Marple stood there, contemplating the chilling nature of human nature, she couldn't help but think of the long-reaching consequences of the choices we make. Gregory's crime wasn't just an attempt to save himself. It was a reflection of the darkness that lived within him. And now, with his world falling apart, he was left to face the consequences of the lies he had woven over the years. Miss Marple had solved the case, but the truth, as always, was far more unsettling than any mystery she had ever unraveled before. The air was thick with tension as Miss Marple watched Sir Gregory standing before her, his posture rigid, his eyes shifting nervously beneath the weight of the revelation. The weight of his guilt hung in the room like a storm cloud, dark and oppressive, and Miss Marple could almost feel the impending collapse of his carefully built world. She had suspected it all along, the mask of control, the carefully constructed lies, the cold, calculated manner in which he had moved through his life, all of it leading up to this moment. The truth was out now, but Gregory wasn't going to give in so easily. The very nature of his crime, the deep-rooted fear of exposure, made it clear he wouldn't simply confess. No, he would try to twist the situation to his advantage, or worse, he might attempt to escape before the law could catch up with him. His mind, sharp and self-preserving, was likely already working on an escape plan. Miss Marple remained calm, the faintest flicker of understanding crossing her face as she realized the next step. She could see the beads of sweat on Gregory's brow, the slight twitch in his hands as he clenched them at his sides. He was cornered, but he was still dangerous. The fact that he had gone to such extremes to cover up his brother's murder showed a mind capable of anything. She had played her part well, drawing him into this trap, setting the stage for the final confrontation. The other suspects had been sent away, leaving just Gregory and Miss Marple in the room. She had made sure of it. This was his moment to face the consequences. She was sure he had a plan to escape or attempt something desperate, but Miss Marple wasn't about to let that happen. "Gregory," Miss Marple began, her voice steady and firm, "you've been running from the truth for too long. You know it, and now we both know it. There's no escape this time. You've already dug your own grave." Gregory's face twisted into a sneer. "You think you've won, Miss Marple? You think the truth will save you? You're just a meddling old woman pretending to understand the complexities of a man's life." His words were venomous, but there was a desperation to his tone now, an edge of panic that hadn't been there before. "Complexity," Miss Marple repeated softly, her gaze unwavering. "There's nothing complex about murder, Gregory. Only fear. Fear of losing everything you've built. Fear of being exposed for the fraud you are." His eyes narrowed. "You think you know me? You don't. You don't know what it's like to have everything you've ever worked for on the line. You wouldn't understand what it's like to have the world threaten to fall apart." "That's where you're wrong," Miss Marple replied, her voice softening ever so slightly. "I understand exactly. But what I don't understand is how someone could destroy their own flesh and blood to protect something so fragile. The lie, the illusion. That's what matters to you. Not family, not truth." Gregory's lips curled into a bitter smile. He laughed, a hollow, unsettling sound that echoed in the quiet room. "You don't get it. Jonathan wasn't just a brother
to me. He was a threat. He would have destroyed everything. Our reputation, our lives. I couldn't let him ruin it. Not after all I've done." Miss Marple could see the cracks in his composure, his mask of indifference slipping as the pressure
mounted. He was unraveling, his control slipping away piece by piece, and Miss Marple knew she had only moments before he did something desperate. The air in the room felt thick, as if everything were holding its breath. "You've already done enough." "Gregory," Miss Marple said softly, but there was an undeniable steel in her words. "The evidence is irrefutable. You killed your brother to protect yourself. You killed him to save your own reputation. And now you'll face the consequences." Gregory took a step back, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for a way out. His chest heaved as he tried to steady his breath, but it was clear he had nowhere left to run. He was trapped. "No," Gregory muttered, his voice growing frantic. "No, I won't let you win. I won't go to prison. You think you can just—" Suddenly, without warning, he bolted toward the door, his movements desperate and panicked. But Miss Marple had anticipated this. With a swift motion, she pressed the hidden switch beneath the desk, and the door locked with a loud click, sealing Gregory inside the room. He froze, his eyes wide with realization. "You'll never escape, Gregory," Miss Marple said calmly, her gaze never leaving his. "There's no way out now." Gregory's expression twisted from one of rage to helplessness as he spun to face her, his breathing shallow and erratic. "You think this is over? You think I'll just go quietly?" He raised his hand, but Miss Marple was unfazed. His threats, his bluster, they meant nothing now. His fear was palpable, and she saw it for what it was. The last attempt of a man who had nowhere left to turn. "No," Miss Marple replied simply, her voice unyielding. "But I do believe the truth is catching up with you. It always does." Gregory opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything more, there was the unmistakable sound of footsteps from the hallway. The police had arrived. They had been waiting just outside, ready for the moment when everything would be revealed. Miss Marple stepped aside, allowing the officers to enter. Gregory stood there, his shoulders slumped in defeat, his earlier bravado completely shattered. The trap had worked. He had tried to run, tried to deny it all, but now he would face the consequences of his actions. "Sir Gregory," one of the officers said, his voice calm but firm, "you're under arrest for the murder of your brother, Jonathan." The last vestiges of resistance left Gregory's body, and he sank to his knees, his eyes hollow with resignation. Miss Marple observed him for a moment longer, the calm certainty of someone who had seen it all before. The villain had been exposed, and the pieces of the puzzle had finally fallen into place. As the officers led Gregory away, Miss Marple stood in the doorway, watching him disappear into the darkness. She could almost feel the weight of the past, lifting from the room as if the very walls had been relieved of their burden. The case was closed. The truth had been revealed, and for Miss Marple, there was nothing more satisfying than seeing justice done, no matter how long it took. As the officers led Sir Gregory from the room, his head hanging low, Miss Marple allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. The case was resolved, the villain had been caught, and the truth had been laid bare. She had seen through Gregory's lies, the web of deceit he had woven so carefully to protect his empire of power and wealth. She had known all along that the truth was lurking beneath the surface, hidden by his meticulous defenses. It had taken time, but justice had prevailed. Yet, as she turned away from the door, there was something unsettling in the air. It wasn't just the hum of the room or the distant voices of the officers as they spoke to Gregory in the hallway. No, it was a deeper feeling, something almost imperceptible. Miss Marple paused, her sharp gaze sweeping over the room, noticing everything and nothing at once. There was a slight tension in her chest, a sense that the final page of this chapter hadn't been turned yet. She thought back to the last few hours, reviewing every word spoken, every moment, and every small detail that had led them here. But there was one thing that nagged at her, something she had overlooked in her pursuit of Gregory. It wasn't the missing letter she'd found tucked away in the drawer, nor the strange discrepancy in the alibis she had so carefully investigated. No, this was something else. Her mind flashed back to a conversation she'd had earlier, when the case had still been shrouded in uncertainty. It had been with Charles Reynolds, the quiet but watchful family solicitor who had until now seemed so reliable. She remembered his unease when Miss Marple had questioned him, how he had seemed oddly stiff, his hands twitching as though caught in a lie. She had brushed it off at the time, too focused on Gregory and his calculated deceit. But now, in the quiet aftermath, the memory of that interaction was like a whisper at the back of her mind. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening, and Charles Reynolds stepped inside, his face grim, his eyes avoiding hers. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice low, "I need to speak with you." She studied him for a long moment, watching as his shoulders tensed under the weight of her gaze. Her suspicion flared again, but she said nothing, only nodding for him to continue. "I didn't think you'd figure it out," Reynolds continued, his voice tight with what seemed like remorse. "But I suppose that's why they always bring in the detectives, isn't it? You see things that no one else can." Miss Marple's pulse quickened as her instincts screamed that something was wrong. She had known deep down that the case couldn't be as simple as it appeared. The pieces had seemed to fall into place so neatly, too neatly. And now here was Reynolds standing before her, confessing, or perhaps trying to hide something far worse. "You're right, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice calm and controlled, masking the sudden rush of realization that was coursing through her. "I do see things others don't, but there's more to this, isn't there? There's more than just Gregory." Reynolds swallowed hard. "I didn't want it to end this way. But you have to understand, Miss Marple, I had no choice. If you hadn't figured it out, if you hadn't seen through the lies—" His words trailed off as he looked toward the door, his hand clenched into a fist at his side. Miss Marple's mind raced. "You didn't want it to end this way," she repeated softly. "But what exactly is it that you didn't want to end? What was your role in all of this, Mr. Reynolds?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting from the door back to her, his face now pale, a sheen of sweat gathering on his brow. He took a breath, and in that moment, the facade cracked. "I wasn't just a solicitor, Miss Marple. I wasn't just someone who handled the family affairs. I was the one who orchestrated everything. I was the one who pushed Gregory into a corner." A chill ran through Miss Marple, and she felt her heart race. "You? But why?" Reynolds stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Because Gregory had to be stopped. He was getting too reckless, too arrogant. He thought he could cover up everything, his brother's murder, the business dealings, the dirty secrets. But I knew if we didn't act, he'd destroy everything. Everything I'd worked for." "Everything?" Miss Marple repeated. "What is it that you wanted, Mr. Reynolds? What was worth all this?" Reynolds seemed to crumble, as if the weight of his own confession was too much to bear. It was the fortune, the power, everything Gregory had. He didn't deserve it. Not after everything he did to his own brother. And I knew that I could take it all, become the one in control. If he was out of the way, I could take over the family business, take over everything. Miss Marple's mind churned with the implications. It had never been about just a single murder, a crime of passion or desperation. It was about control. It was about money and power and everything Reynolds had been willing to destroy to claim it for himself. She had been wrong to focus so entirely on Gregory. He was just a pawn, manipulated by someone who had been hiding in plain sight all along. "You thought you could manipulate him into doing your bidding," Miss Marple said, piecing it all together. "You convinced him to murder his brother, knowing it would ruin him, but you—" She paused. "You thought you could use him to cover your tracks." Reynolds nodded slowly, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "And I thought I had it. All, Miss Marple. I thought you'd never figure it out." Just then, there was a soft noise from the hallway. Miss Marple's sharp eyes flicked toward the door. Behind it, a faint rustling could be heard. Before she could react, the door swung open, and an officer stepped in, his face grim. "Miss Marple, there's been another development," he said quickly. "Gregory, he's gone." For a moment, everything stopped. The shock rippled through the room, but before Miss Marple could respond, the officer continued. "He's been released. Someone paid for his bail. And there's more. Reynolds. He's gone too." It was happening again. The pieces slipping just beyond reach. But this time, Miss Marple knew the game had shifted entirely. The room fell into a tense silence as the officer's words hung in the air. Miss Marple stood motionless for a moment, her thoughts racing, her mind piecing together a puzzle that seemed to have taken on an entirely new shape in the span of a few moments. Gregory had been released, and now Reynolds was gone too, the feeling of unease, the sharp flicker of doubt that had lingered in her chest, suddenly blossomed into something far more troubling. She had missed something, and now the trap they had set was crumbling, slipping between her fingers. "What do you mean, Gregory's gone?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, an underlying urgency. The officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly uneasy about the turn of events. "We were just about to move on him, ma'am. We had everything lined up, but before we could—" He paused, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to rush in. "Before we could make a move, he was gone. Bail was posted under another name. And Reynolds—" He glanced at Miss Marple, as though waiting for her to process the magnitude of the situation. Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. "How long ago did this happen?" "Less than an hour. No one saw it coming. We've already sealed the exits. They can't have gone far." The officer's voice was tight with frustration, but Miss Marple wasn't listening to the officer anymore. Her mind had already leapt ahead, connecting the dots that no one else had even considered. It wasn't just the bail that bothered her. It was the timing, the way it had all unfolded so swiftly. Whoever had orchestrated Gregory's release was playing a different game, one she hadn't been able to anticipate. Miss Marple turned her attention back to the officer. "Gather the team. We need to check the files again, all of them." "But Miss Marple," the officer began hesitantly, "we already reviewed the records." "I know," she interrupted softly. "But we missed something important. There's always one piece, isn't there? Something small that slipped through the cracks." The officer looked at her, confusion flickering in his eyes. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the desk where the file lay open. Notes, witness statements, the transcripts. It was all there, waiting, but it wasn't the usual type of clues that had caught her attention now. It was the pattern she had been overlooking, the one that seemed so simple, so obvious now. She felt the truth settle in her chest like a weight. "Check the names of the people who posted Gregory's bail," Miss Marple instructed firmly, "and make sure they're connected to Reynolds in some way." The officer nodded, clearly trying to keep up, but Miss Marple had already turned back to the room, scanning for something she couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't just about catching Gregory or Reynolds anymore. They were pawns in a much bigger game, and Miss Marple could feel the final piece of the puzzle just beyond her reach. "Miss Marple," the officer hesitated. "What exactly are you looking for?" Miss Marple paused, considering her answer. The puzzle pieces were all scattered in front of her, but this last one had eluded her for too long. "A connection," she murmured. "A connection we missed." She turned sharply to face the officer. Again, it was never about Gregory. He was always a distraction. It was Reynolds who had something to lose. But not in the way we thought. Her voice was steady, but inside she was racing to put it all together. She had been so focused on the outward deception, the obvious lies, that she had missed the more subtle signs, the ones that could have connected the entire scheme. The release of Gregory, the missing evidence, Reynolds' actions, they had all been part of a bigger plan, one that relied on misdirection. The officer's footsteps echoed as he rushed to the desk, typing in the search request for the bail information. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "You see, it's all about control," she continued, her voice quiet but firm. "Reynolds didn't just want power. He wanted to eliminate any threats to his control. Gregory, his brother's death, it was all part of a game. And we were all part of it, whether we realized it or not," the officer returned, holding up a printed list of names. "There," he said, his voice grim. These are the people who posted bail. Reynolds' name is at the top of the list, but this one, he pointed to another name, one that Miss Marple hadn't expected. This is the name of an associate of Reynolds, a former business partner from years ago. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The name rang familiar to her, a fleeting memory from her earlier investigation. She hadn't thought to check for old associates, not until now. The name on the list was tied to a case long forgotten, a quiet, unsolved mystery involving shady dealings, backroom promises, and a family fortune. Reynolds had hidden the truth in plain sight, manipulating every possible angle to ensure his escape when the time came. "Well, that's our link," Miss Marple said softly. Reynolds didn't just want Gregory out of the way. He wanted to make sure that no one could stand in his way, that the fortune and power would remain his. He used every connection at his disposal to cover his tracks. The officer's face flushed with the weight of the revelation. "You think he's behind everything?" Gregory was just his pawn. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Exactly. Gregory was too emotionally invested, too easy to manipulate. Reynolds, on the other hand, knew how to play the long game. He knew exactly how to cover his steps, and that's why he's gone now. He's made his move, and we're left picking up the pieces." She turned, walking toward the door. "Gather the team," she said once more, her voice resolute. "We may have missed our chance to catch them here, but we haven't lost. We'll find them, and we'll finish what we started." As she walked out of the room, she could feel the weight of the investigation still hanging in the air, unfinished, unresolved, like a dark cloud lingering on the horizon. Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. Justice wasn't just about solving the case. It was about the truth, and sometimes the truth wasn't something that could be caught in a net. Sometimes it slipped away, elusive, like shadows under the full moon. And yet Miss Marple felt a flicker of hope, a quiet certainty that in the end the truth would find its way to the surface, even if it had to be dragged there by the light of day. Miss Marple walked briskly through the dimly lit corridor, her shoes clicking softly against the marble floor, the quiet murmur of the station fading behind her. It had been a long day, a day filled with revelations, twists and turns. Yet she still felt unsettled. The weight of the case, its tangled web of lies and manipulation, clung to her like a heavy cloak. For all the pieces they had uncovered, for all the answers they had found, there was still something nagging at the edges of her mind that didn't sit quite right. She paused just outside the station doors, the cool evening air brushing against her face. The sky above was a pale canvas, streaked with the faint colors of the setting sun. But her thoughts were far from the beauty of the moment. The case had been solved, at least on the surface. Reynolds had been caught, the evidence was undeniable, and the hidden ties between him and Gregory had finally been brought into the light. Yet as she stood there, her hands clasped together in front of her, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that the final piece had not yet fallen into place. She glanced back at the door she had just walked through. Inside, the officers were already preparing the paperwork, tying up loose ends. Reynolds was in custody, his confession all but signed, sealed, and delivered. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But something about his final moments, the way he had surrendered so calmly without a fight, struck her as wrong. There was no desperation in him, no regret. He had been too composed, too certain that it was all over. "Miss Marple," the voice broke through her reverie, and she turned to find Detective Inspector Davis approaching, his face weary but relieved. "We've got everything sorted. The case is closed. I'll make sure you're kept in the loop with any updates, but I don't expect anything more to come of it." "Thank you, Inspector," she replied, offering him a polite smile, though her mind was already elsewhere. "I'm sure you'll do just that." She hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But I wonder, Inspector, do you really think it's over?" Davis's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced down at the documents still tucked beneath her arm, the case files that had once seemed so full of promise but now felt empty. A nagging sense of doubt lingered. It wasn't the case itself, it was too neat, too perfect. There was a thread, however thin, that she had yet to pull, one that might unravel the entire picture. "I'm not sure I can explain it, Miss Marple," said her voice low, "but I feel as though we're missing something small, a detail that no one's noticed. Perhaps something that's been right in front of us all along, just waiting to be uncovered." Inspector Davis looked at her for a moment, skepticism creeping into his gaze. He opened his mouth to respond, but paused, as though something in her words had resonated with him, however faintly. "You know, I've heard that sort of talk before," he said, his tone a little softer. "The one last thing that never quite lets you go. Maybe you're right. Maybe there is something more here." Miss Marple gave him a small, knowing smile. "The thing about mysteries, Inspector, is that they never truly end. They simply evolve, waiting for the next person to ask the right question." She turned to leave, her steps measured, but in her mind, the pieces of the puzzle still danced just out of reach. As she walked down the steps toward the street, the sun dipping lower in the sky, she couldn't help but replay the case in her mind. The way Reynolds had been so eager to take the fall for everything, his calm demeanor despite the mounting evidence against him, his willingness to implicate Gregory without hesitation, it had all been too smooth. Miss Marple was no stranger to human nature. She knew how people behaved under pressure, how they reacted when their lies were exposed. And Reynolds, she realized, had been too clean, too polished in his confession. Then there was the matter of the cryptic message she had found earlier, hidden within the folds of a discarded letter. She had never been able to fully decipher it, but she hadn't forgotten about it either. It had been too deliberate, too intentional. She didn't believe it had been left behind by mistake, as the officers had suggested. No, it was meant to be found. Someone was sending a message. But who and why? Miss Marple sighed, the weight of the mystery pressing heavily on her chest. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small scrap of paper she had saved, unfolding it carefully. The message still stared back at her, its meaning as elusive as ever. The shadows stretch long, but the light will burn bright. What did it mean? Who had left it? And more importantly, what did it have to do with the case? She stopped in her tracks, her eyes scanning the street. The soft murmur of the evening crowd surrounded her. But in the back of her mind she could hear the faint echo of footsteps. Someone was watching, waiting. The thought lingered, and though she couldn't pinpoint the source, she knew she wasn't alone. Miss Marple tucked the paper back into her pocket, her fingers lingering on the edge for a moment. She could feel the familiar tug of curiosity, that gentle pull toward the unknown. It had been a long day, a satisfying one, but she knew better than most that when a mystery seemed too neatly solved, it was rarely the final chapter. And so, as she walked away, the city streets quieting behind her, the question still lingered in the air like smoke. What had she missed? For Miss Marple, the mystery was never truly over. It merely waited for the next twist, the next turn, the next question. And when the time came, she would be ready to uncover the truth, whatever it might be. Because in the end, the detective's work was never done. Not as long as there were shadows lurking in the corners waiting to emerge.